welcome everyone, and thank you for joining us for our ARI Seminar, Growing with the Flow. I'm Tess McLaren, the Acting Science Manager of Knowledge's Behaviour and Science Impact, and I'll be the MC. I'd also like to introduce Penelope Jordan. Penelope will be sharing links and monitoring the chat for questions. Thanks, Penelope. I'd like to begin by acknowledging the traditional owners of the land I'm joining you from, the Wurundjeri people, and pay my respects to their elders past and present. I would also like to extend that acknowledgement and respect to any traditional owners of the lands that we're all dialing in from today. Today we have two excellent talks with an environmental water focus. To start us off, we have Dr. Chris Jones from ARI on managing riverine vegetation with flows, what we know and what's next, followed by Piyumi Wijepala from the University of Melbourne talking to us about understanding the impact of flow timing and duration on native riparian understorey plants. We'll have time for questions at the end of each talk, so please write your questions in the chat and Penelope will read them out when we get to that section. If we don't get to your questions, our presenters are happy for you to contact them via email. All right, let's get started. Over to you, Chris.
Thanks, Tess. I'll try to progress the slide. Great. All right, thank you everyone for coming along. It's great to have a bit of an audience, people interested in plants. Always a good thing to see. I'm going to talk about managing riverine vegetation in a very general sense across a lot of projects. So I've been working on waterways and vegetation at ARI for 8 years now. And over that time, we've learned a lot. We've been doing lots of work in lots of different ways, and I'll try to summarise a lot of that today to give you a bit of an overview. It'll be a bit of a whirlwind, but hopefully I'll be able to explain it so everyone can follow. Firstly, I'd like to do an acknowledgement of country for the work, all the work that happened as part of this research. So there's a lot of places that we spent a lot of time out in the field and a lot of time in the office as well. So I'm presenting now from Wurundjeri country, and I did work all over the state as part of this with a large team of people. And we had a lot of work as well at the University of Melbourne, where Piyumi, their second talk, she'll be presenting from and talking about her work as well. All right, so why am I talking about this and why do we care about vegetation? It's because there's a bit of a challenge for riparian vegetation throughout our landscapes. That's because of lots of different factors. A lot of it is related to regulation of waterways, so structures putting in to alter the flow regimes, large dams to capture the flow, and other factors such as livestock grazing, land clearing, these sorts of things. And all of this impacts our native vegetation populations. So I want to take you through what a riparian zone looks like, what the riverine vegetation comprises. So here's a schematic cross-section of a river. So we're taking a slice out of a river, we've got the water down the bottom, and up on the top is the floodplain, so up on the bank. So we have vegetation that occurs in lots of different groups. They can be sliced and diced in lots of different ways, but here's some examples of common groups that people use to describe different categories of vegetation. And if we put these onto the waterway, they occur in different places in relation to flow regimes that are changing in relation to water or regulation activities. So aquatic vegetation is down the bottom. It's in the wettest part of the channel where it's always wet, and it requires usually perennial water supplies to sustain these plants. Emergent vegetation shifts a little bit up. They like being in the water, but they can persist higher up, particularly if there's elevated flows. Amphibious vegetation is a little bit higher up. They don't like being in the permanent water or the near permanent water very much, but just above that and up until the flow peak levels. And then terrestrial vegetation occupies the higher part outside of the reach of most of the flows, although they do encroach down into the wetter areas at times. Then our trees sit amongst there, depending on what species they are and where we are in the landscape. So this is an example of an intact riverine vegetation community with different vegetation dynamics going along here. So what we see with regulation, though, is that through water capture and harvesting, a lot of the elevated flow components recede. They disappear as water is caught in dams and released for regulation. So we have a relatively stable flow regime that's pretty flat. And in the absence of those elevated flow components, we lose a lot of our riparian species, so amphibious and emergent species in particular, and those are replaced by terrestrial species. So managers try to undo these impacts by reinstating flow components to reduce the terrestrial species encroachment and reinstate the riparian ones. So it sounds pretty simple, should be pretty straightforward, not too hard, but the reality is not actually quite like that. And through managed events that the managers try to deliver, such as base flows down low on the bank, summer freshers, which is a flow pulse for a few days to a week or two, and a spring fresh or a high flow, which brings water quite high. They're trying to achieve these objectives, but it's not as easy as it sounds, particularly because there's other factors involved as well. So invasive tree species such as willows, invasive riparian or flood-tolerant species, so blackberries, which are pretty hardy to flows, even though they're not aquatic or riparian plants, and then livestock. They're all having a big impact and limit our ability to do what we want with in riparian zones to make improvements. So managers have objectives. They try to use flow components, so base flows that are quite low, large high flows and fresh pulses to achieve management objectives. These vary depending on what the flow is, when it's delivered, the depth, the duration, the speed of the flow. Those different attributes influence what these things do. For vegetation, we try to deliver these at different times of the year. Managers will deliver some things throughout the year, some things particularly in winter or spring when there's naturally elevated flows in a temperate climate, or freshers through summer or winter to achieve a particular objective. Now, all of those things, those management flows, are trying to achieve several functions. There's a collection here, and I'll go through them in detail. You don't have to know them all now, but they're trying to do different things, either providing habitat, providing soil moisture to plants, impacting terrestrial versus riparian plants, reproduction, recruitment, and all of those things influence these three key population processes of longevity, recruitment, and dispersal, things that plants need to maintain healthy populations. And if we get those right, we can maintain a healthy riverine ecosystem for vegetation. So I'm going to go through some of our work here that talks about the evidence for these things. So the evidence that they occur, and then whether or not it is a benefit, these flow actions provide a benefit to the vegetation communities or not. At the moment, we're starting initially we were starting off in a pretty low bar. We didn't know a lot. There was examples from internationally, interstate, other sorts of places and previous work, but we didn't have a lot of good evidence for what Victorian waterways were doing. One example of things that were resolved was in earlier stages of VEFMAP, there was some pretty conclusive evidence of terrestrial plant invasion being reduced by flows, which was a great start, and we were trying to build on that. The only thing is that we didn't know a lot about the detail. When did it matter about when the flow occurred or how long the flow was? We knew a bit, but we needed to know more. So we went about resolving these uncertainties by collecting data in lots of ways, lots of lines of evidence to try to get a good understanding. So this included field surveys across the state and a lot of waterways. It included field experiments, so putting up structures, so grazing exclosures, carp exclosures, doing soil moisture surveys, things out in the field to collect data through manipulations of the environment. We also did ex situ nursery experiments. All of these were done at the University of Melbourne through extensive collaborator Joe Greet and his team and many students, which was really a really important part of this research, large student contribution to a lot of this work too. And this was really helpful to supplement some of our work in the field because the field is inherently messy and variable. And so being able to control some of the conditions was really useful to isolate impacts of water and on plants. We also had a huge amount of data analysis. So this is obviously a disgusting slide, but that's the point. There's lots and lots of things that we've done, huge amounts of data collected from the field, from experimental work that has fed into our understanding. We've also done several projects relating to hydrological analysis. A lot of this work was partnered with Streamology, but also other environmental consultants at Jacobs to try to understand the below ground, so soil hydrology, as well as above ground hydrology and dynamics in relation to flow regimes, which is all important in a study that's looking at flows. And finally, we use a lot of conceptual models, just thinking about how all these pieces fit together, describing how those connections work, and then using those that understanding to try to guide decision making. Some of this work, a lot of this work is done with collaborators, and Megan Good as well externally from doing a lot of work with our decision making processes. So we're coming back to our flow management objectives. We've got several bits of uncertainty that we're trying to resolve. And so how do we go about it? I'll go through each one of these function boxes individually to describe essentially what we found. So here we are in our system. We're going to start with aquatic vegetation habitat, the first one. So this is actually providing water, providing aquatic habitat to in-stream plants. And so what we found was that there was evidence and a benefit for both, for flows. However, the impact of elevated flows, summer freshers and spring freshers, had relatively little impact on aquatic plants. Essentially, the aquatic plants are out of reach of those things. They're impacted only really by the base flows of these waterways. And so freshers and higher flows weren't really influential on influencing the aquatic plant habitat. However, in intermittent or drier systems where flow levels became quite low, the environmental flows were really important for trying to maintain habitat, maintain live plants in pools in the absence of flow. So there was a benefit, but only in specific situations, only in the drier systems. In most waterways, there was a marginal benefit where there's perennial water. So that was really good. We know that for aquatic plants, they're largely looking after themselves once they occur in most perennial waterways. Our second function was the soil moisture provision, adding water to plants to make them grow. Now, it sounds pretty straightforward, but we wanted to understand how this works, and it's pretty complex when it comes to waterways. Firstly, we have a groundwater supply, which sits somewhere down below the surface soil and is influenced by the waterway. Now, this shape of the groundwater profile can be extremely variable. This is one example of what it could be, an example where the groundwater is below the bed of the river. And so if the surface water ceased to flow, the river or the creek would run dry. There's lots of other systems where you would have other things, but this is an example to show you how it works. So from a base flow provision, the soil moisture progresses and then diminishes as it progresses out through the bank to meet the groundwater supply. This provides benefits to vegetation close to the bank. And what we see is where there's a lot of water for these plants, they develop short, tough, expansive root systems. It's also important for species midway at the bank that are deeper rooted, and so they can reach the influenced groundwater. But little seedlings and things higher at the bank are not benefited at all by these base flows. Summer freshers or mid-level freshers do provide some more of that water supply to those plants, and some of the seedlings or higher plants, as well as some of the high bank riparian vegetation. But it's only, again, these deeper rooted plants. It's the surface water that is required to benefit those fully. And so we have these larger spring freshers or high flows, which provide water very high up the bank, which enable watering of the surface soil, which benefits all of these different plants. So the deeper rooted ones, higher up the bank, but as well as seedlings and short rooted plants as well. Now, our trees are relatively immune to the spring fresh pulses in a perennial waterway. yeah, especially the mature trees that are able to access the groundwater throughout. However, as we move further away from the channel, up onto the top of the bank and over on the floodplain, it's likely that freshers might contribute to those trees more so, but we don't understand that particularly well. So there's some really interesting dynamics here going on, and the timing of these flows is really important to understanding how to manage these benefits. But yes, there is evidence of benefits to the vegetation, and we've been able to quantify that as part of our research. Now, terrestrial plant encroachment is the one that we already knew that was occurring, but we didn't know much about the detail. We didn't know specifically if there was differences between freshers at different times of the year and how long it took to impact plants. What we found through several experiments was that you can put a plant underwater, and anything that's not an aquatic plant will actually decline in health. Riparian plants will decline in health if they're put underwater, and so will terrestrial plants. However, the terrestrial plants are much more sensitive, and they will decline in health faster, and they will die earlier than the riparian plants. So it's not that riparian plants love being underwater, it's just that they're more tolerant of it than the terrestrial ones. And so what we found is that if you're inundating terrestrial plants for as much as 2 weeks in summer can kill them, but it takes maybe 4 to 6 weeks in winter. So there was a strong impact of season, and terrestrial plants were a lot more sensitive to inundation than riparian plants. So the sweet spot is being able to time our flow events to be able to give a greater disbenefit to the terrestrial plants than the riparian ones, so that we can shift the competitive dominance away from terrestrial plants towards riparian ones. And knowing these times and how it varies with season it gives us a really good ability to strategically manage flow events to achieve this switch of dominance. So looking good so far. Reproduction, I'm not going to go into this too much here because this is a talk that Piyumi will talk about next. So her PhD is focusing on this, and she'll be able to go through it in detail. So one where I won't wash over it. So I'll leave it up to her. The next one is seed germination, and we looked at a lot at thousands and thousands of seedlings, hundreds of thousands actually over the 8-year period, to look at when seedlings pot up and in relation to flows. And in most cases, terrestrial plants respond to rainfall. Rainfall comes through in autumn and there's a germination trigger. In some cases, riparian plants do that as well. However, the freshers, subsequent freshers in spring and summer also trigger germination, and much more so for riparian plants than terrestrial plants. And so there was a strong signal of benefit for flooding response for germination later in the season than there was for terrestrial plants. So again, these flow events were able to be really beneficial, particularly these elevated ones, for germination of seed. If it's a really hot summer subsequently, some of those might die, but germination and triggering that cue is really important to giving the chance for plants to grow. So again, that's reinforced. And finally, the non-flow factors. These are the things that influence vegetation responses to flow. And what we did find is evidence for all of these things. So dense shade through exotic plants such as willows had a significant negative impact on riparian plants. However, sparse shade from red gum canopy didn't have any measured negative influence on these plants. So it's a real threshold between the exotic dense canopies and the native open canopies. Blackberries or any other exotic plant that was dense and occupied the riparian zone had a strong negative impact on all of our riparian zone. They just outcompete them, and there's a real arm wrestle going on between the two. And you can't use flows to get rid of those plants, so it needs other management actions. So there's a real challenge in a lot of waterways, and that's particularly so in high rainfall areas. And finally, livestock grazing had a negative effect in a lot of places, although it was heavily influenced by the density of the stock, the steepness of the banks, accessibility to them, and those other factors. So a lot of these non-flow factors had really strong impacts. and we were able to quantify a lot of them, although there were some still remaining unknowns. So we come back to our overall model here, and we've replaced a whole bunch of our question marks with evidence of benefit from flow management, which was very important, which is exactly what we set out to achieve. Our gaps here for the reproduction, Piyumi will be able to address that next. But we have a lot of remaining questions, though, about what comes next. And so some of these examples about the gaps that are still remaining, some of the important ones, relating to resilience to floods, so the higher levels. So what happens when a flood comes over the top, way over the bank, which we've seen a lot in the last few years, and how can we manage vegetation systems to be resilient to those large-scale floods or droughts in between those large events. Likewise, with water quality, we understand a fair bit in relation to turbidity, but we don't know the thresholds for different water quality issues for aquatic plants in particular. Turbidity, salinity, these sorts of factors. So we're not sure exactly what are our limiting factors. We also have recruitment of aquatic plants, which is a very tricky one. We know that we can maintain aquatic plants that exist, but getting recruitment of plants is quite tricky because they don't reproduce from seed very often. And finally, we have a lot of uncertainty around our coordinated management. So we know that we can't just deliver flows and get a good riparian zone. We have to also factor in all of these other conditions. So our livestock, bank stability, exotic species, and a lot of these other factors in one. So it needs to be coordinated management across these things is where we'll get our best outcomes. And that's it.
Awesome. Thanks, Chris. That was brilliant. A massive body of work and an excellent summary across all of that work. So if anyone has any questions for Chris, you can pop them in the chat. I've got a couple of questions that have been pre-prepared. Penny, did you want to ask them, or happy for me to ask them?
Happy for you, Tess.
Yep, no worries. So, Chris, this work focuses a lot on Victorian waterways. How applicable are the results to other Australian states and internationally?
Yeah, sure. Because it's a state government funded program, a lot that we work through. So it's a Victorian Environmental Flows Monitoring and Assessment Program where a lot of this comes from, with other connection to other programs as well. We focus on Victorian waterways, the data collection. However, it's really applicable to a lot of other temperate climates in Australia in particular, and temperate climates internationally. We've done a lot of work on trying to publish these outputs and making sure that they speak to the broader literature for international audience as well. And in that process, we look at the patterns in how our research findings relate to those of others interstate and internationally. There's a lot of overlap. So there's a really good thing is that the general patterns are quite consistent. There's a lot of consistent mechanisms in this process that are really useful, and they tend to hold. However, the individual species that occur vary considerably within Victoria across waterways and also interstate and internationally.
Yeah, awesome. Another question, actually, Penny, do you want to go to some of the ones from the chat?
Yeah, if that's okay. We've got two so far. So one is about freshwater mussels. Freshwater mussels are in decline. Did you look at their watering filtering impacts at all?
We haven't looked at that, no. However, the impacts so there's been a lot of work recently on freshwater mussels and their ability to filter water and so to clean it. From a turbidity point of view, we know that there are negative impacts of high turbidity on aquatic plants, aquatic in particular, and submerged ones. And so certainly that would suggest that if you were able to reduce that turbidity, then that would provide a benefit to aquatic plants. However, we haven't done any work on being able to say what the connection with mussels might be in that case. So how many mussels would you need to be able to reduce the turbidity from a undesirable level to a desirable one? Those sorts of things aren't known in the different waterways. There's lots of uncertainties there, but the ecology of freshwater mussels is improving. We've been doing a fair bit of that research at ARI as well, and also conservation of threatened mussels as well. So it's a really good point, but lots of uncertainties there.
There's another couple. Was any of the work involved looking at either urban waterways or areas that have been fire or flood affected? Sorry, that's a big question.
Yeah, no, it's good. So we didn't do a lot of urban waterway research because most of the work, so our work was focused on regional areas. And so we steered clear mostly of the urban zones. However, we know that there's a lot of impacts from. So one thing that's important is that in urban areas there's a greater prevalence of exotic species that invade. So there's the competition with exotic species is greater. The other thing about urban areas is the high impervious surface that increases the runoff. So there's more concrete and bitumen that all rushes into the river and waterways. And so waterways in urban areas tend to be more flashy. You get these really sharp peaks really quickly. So as PhD student Scott McKendrick has been doing work with Joe and the WERG team at Melbourne Uni, doing a lot of trying to understand the impacts of that flashiness or the flows in urban areas. So other researchers are focusing quite on that, but we've been looking more at the agricultural or regional areas of Victoria. In fires and things, we don't tend to work with directly with fires, and also a lot of the fires that happened, the bushfires that occurred in recent years, were in mountain regions, so upland areas. Those areas are not where a lot of the environmental water is delivered, because there's a lot of higher unregulated areas, fewer structures all above the dams, essentially, whereas most of our work happens below the major reservoirs on the lowland country.
Okay, cool. We've got quite a few others, but they're a bit specific, so we might get back to them, I think, rather than getting you to answer them now.
No
Tess,
problem.
if you wanted to answer, to ask another question, you're welcome to.
Yes, there was actually one that we had was this research has obviously covered a lot of ground and answered a lot of our questions. How much is there left to do? Like, what are the questions that are still remaining?
Yeah, well, there's a lot. So it is true. We've addressed a lot of our uncertainties, which has been really good. And the only way we're able to do that was because of the multiple lines of evidence that I suggested. So we collected lots of field data, but if we didn't do a lot of the supplementary actions as well, collaborating with external researchers, doing ex situ and in situ experiments, we never would have been able to develop the understanding that we have from all of this work. So we've come a long way. We know we've filled a lot of these knowledge gaps. However, with every single one of them, we only know part of the story. We've got evidence from one or two waterways, from a certain range of conditions. We don't have the rest of the range. And so there's still the other parts to the puzzle that are missing. So there's still a lot more work to do. We certainly haven't finished it, but we're a lot further than we were before, and I think we're in a place where we can really leverage our current understanding to make really good decisions and really efficient and effective management actions going forward.
Yeah, awesome. Thanks so much, Chris. And Penny's put the link in the chat to the ARI page that relates to this work, so you'll be able to find a lot of the papers related to that on there, and also on the ARI publications page. So I think we'll move across to Piyumi now to talk about her work that she's done on this topic. Thanks, Piyumi.
Yeah, thanks, Tess. Hello, everyone. So today I'll be talking about the impact of flow timing and duration on native riparian understory plants. So with Chris' early presentation, now we have a clear idea about how important riparian plants in a riparian zone. But again, in briefly, riparian plants, they connect aquatic and terrestrial habitats, and they support high biodiversity, and they provide important ecosystem services in a riparian zone. And these plants, their growth, their survival, and their reproduction, they all highly impacted by the river flows. So in my overall PhD project, I'll be looking at how riparian recruitment and reproduction is affected by different environmental flows. But in this presentation, I'll be focusing on outcomes of 2 experiments that I have been done so far, and focusing on specific questions that which forms the part of the story that Chris was trying to tell you earlier. So in this presentation, I'll be going through one of the nursery experiment and a field-based experiment that I have done so far. So first, I'd like to go through the nursery experiment that I have done to identify the effect of inundation timing and duration on the growth and reproduction of native riparian and terrestrial plants. So in this figure, you can see how seasonal flow patterns has been changed in natural riverway and a regulated river flow. So solid line indicates the natural flow and dashed line indicates the regulated flow. And also it represents the different life stages of a typical riparian plant. And in a riparian plant, most of their growth and reproduction is happening in spring and summer. And also in this figure, you can see they can be exposed to unseasonal flow and they get partially or fully submerged in a regulated flow, which is not happening in the natural flow. So again, earlier in Chris' presentation, he mentioned about how different plant forms spread along the river bank. So this figure also represents similar to that. But what I wanted to highlight here is, so these different plant forms, they can be positioned along the river bank in a different time of the year at different time of their life stage, such as their seedling stage, such as their establishment or maturity level. And especially in a regulated river flow, they can get partially or fully submerged to different types of flows. And this can be in different duration and different time of the year. So that will be useful to know how these different plant forms going to respond to these different type of flows, especially in a regulated river flow. So based on that, we conducted a nursery experiment using native grasses species and native riparian species. So these are the species that I have used. So upper row represent the native grasses that I have used for the experiment, and bottom row represent the native riparian plants that I've used for the experiment. They are all native plants that can be commonly seen in the southeastern Australian river system. So as I mentioned earlier, I want to look at how flow duration and flow timing going to affect their growth and reproduction. So in this experiment for the flow duration, we have put 3 durations, which is no inundation, and one is a short inundation and a long inundation, and during spring and summertime. So in briefly, we started this experiment onset of spring 2022, and it continued until the summer in 2023. So at the first stage of the spring, plants look smaller, and in the summer they got bit growth. And with the flow duration, what we have used is no inundation and 1 week of short inundation where they get fully submerged for 1 week, and a long inundation where they got fully submerged for 4 weeks. So this is how the experiment setup looked like, and we conducted it at Burnley University of Melbourne. So after purchasing plants from a commercial nursery, we put them in the pots and we put them in a glass house to get established for 1 month. And then we transferred them to the treatment tanks. So each tank represents 1 treatment. So we had 6 treatments, and in each tank we have 3 plants for each treatment, and we have 3 tanks for each treatment. So there were 18 tanks representing 6 treatments. So this is how it looked like inside a treatment tank, and this is how it looked like after it get fully submerged during the experiment. So for the plant measurement, initially I took the plant biomass of the seedlings, their shoot and root biomass, and for the weekly measurement, I measured the plant growth, flowering data, and seeding data if available. And at the completion of the experiment, I took the plant biomass and seed germinability of the plants. And then we briefly go through what we have seen and some of the results that we have seen so far in this experiment. So this graph shows the changes in plant total biomass, which is the total of shoot and root of plant biomass. So as I explained earlier, we had 6 treatments for 2 seasons, spring and summer. So blue color represent the spring treatment. The higher the intensity means, the higher the duration. And pink color explain the summer inundation. Again, higher intensity means higher duration. So let's look at the data. So upper row represent the native grass species. So here what we can see is these native grasses, they have a negative impact for the spring long inundation and summer long inundation, except for the Botryoclova macra plant. But when it comes to the riparian plant, there seems to have not doing well with the spring long inundation compared to the summer long spring short inundation, but they tend to do well with the summer short and summer long inundation. So in summary, what we can see here is less inundation is favorable for grasses regardless of the season, and riparian plant, they can tolerate short spring and summer and long summer inundation compared to the but not well for the spring long inundation. So this is one of the treatment tank which get exposed to the spring long inundation. This is 1 week after the spring long inundation. You can see all the plants are not looking very happy, but red circled ones are the dead grass species. So this image here shows the treatment tank which exposed to the summer long inundation. So it shows, again, the red circled one shows the dead grass species. So here you can see, even though the grass species are dying due to the summer long inundation, some of the riparians, such as Eleucharis, they are happily flowering. So let's look at how the flowering data, what the flowering data shows in this experiment. So again, the same treatment and same species and same color coordinates. So let's look at what happened with the grasses species. So again, it looks like long summer and long spring inundation seems to be less favorable for the grasses flowering, except for the Botryoclova macra. So these are the riparian plants. So we had 4 riparian plant species, but out of these 4, only 2 riparian plant species flowered during the experiment. So what we can see here is riparian plant tend to flower in longer duration, either in spring or summer inundation. So this is so far what we have seen in our nursery experiment. So next I would like to go through what we have seen in the field experiment, which we have conducted to find the effect of spring fresh river flow on mature riparian plants. So spring fresh is one of the most commonly delivered environmental flow, and it is mimicking the natural rainfall-driven peak. So there are lots of expected environmental objectives by delivering the spring fresh, such as improving the existing native vegetation and the establishment, and reduce the terrestrial vegetation, and trigger the recruitment of native flood-tolerant vegetation. So in this experiment, what we wanted to look at is when mature grass species and mature riparian plant get fully submerged during a spring fresh event in the field, what it's going to be like for their growth and reproduction. So this field experiment was conducted at Campaspe River in northern Victoria. So we have choose 3 upstream sites and 3 downstream sites. So 3 downstream sites received environmental flow during 2023, a small spring fresh event to conduct this experiment. So in every site, we wanted to put our plants in 2 layers. One is in a lower bank and one is in upper bank. And we wanted to make sure that lower bank plants get fully submerged during a spring fresh event. So for this, again, we used 5 plant species representing grasses and riparian plant. So this is what it was looked like in one of the sites. This is in Campaspe River Dogs Reserve site. So this is how we have planted our plants in lower bank and upper bank, and then they get exposed to the spring fresh event, and that's how it looked like at the initial stage. So this is the spring fresh event that we had during last year. So for the data collection and for the experiment, for conducting the experiment, what we did was we planted our plants 1 month before the spring fresh event, and then we did our initial spring survey 1.5 weeks before the spring fresh event, and then we had 2 post-spring surveys. One is 1 month after spring fresh event, and the last one is 2 months after post-spring survey, after spring fresh event. And for the data, we collected plant growth, survival, reproduction, and soil moisture. So let's see what we have seen so far in this experiment. So first, I'd like to go through the survival of these plant species. So again, a messy graph, but it's simple. I'll take you through that. So as I mentioned, we had 5 species representing grasses and representing riparian plants, and we had 3 upstream sites and 3 downstream sites. And as I mentioned earlier, we had 2 levels of plants, one in lower level and one in upper level. So blue color represent the lower level and brown color represent the upper level. So here I would like to focus more on downstream site where we received the spring fresh event. So you can see in 2 downstream site, survival rate is really low in most of the plants, and except the downstream site 1. This is mainly because these 2 sites have been highly impacted by grazing, and this downstream site 1, they didn't have any signs of grazing event. So this is actually highly impacting on the growth and reproduction, and the taking the data for the other reproduction data for our experiment as well. So now let's look at how the plant growth in this species in this location. Again, same color coordinate. So again, I would like to emphasize on downstream side what happened there. So we can see plants in lower level bank, they had a reduced growth in all downstream sites except downstream site 1. And again, in the downstream site 2 and downstream site 3, plant growth of the upper bank had a greater reduced growth compared to the lower bank. So what happened in the downstream site 1 is we can see increase in the plant growth in all species except Botrichlora macra in the lower bank plants. Also, we can see an increase in the upper plants in the upper bank level. So what happened here is, what we can speculate here is this site is highly vegetated. Even in the upper bank, there were a bit of vegetation other than the plants that we planted there. So they might have provided protection and a moisture to the upper plants that were in the upper bank level. And also it didn't get fully submerged during a spring fresh event. So they might have, that may be the reason that they might have worked well for all the species compared to the lower one. So this is what I have so far to share for today. And based on these 2 experiments, I'd like to summarize what these results tells us so far. So shorter spring and shorter summer inundation seems to be beneficial for the riparian. And longer spring inundation seems to have a negative impact on riparian compared to the longer summer inundation. But with the terrestrial grasses, we can see less inundation is better regardless of the season. And when it comes to the reproduction or the flowering, riparian plants tend to flower in longer inundation, either in spring or summer. But terrestrial grass flowering had a negative impact in longer spring and summer inundation. But what we have seen in the field experiment, other factors like grazing and sedimentation can really have a bad impact on riparian and terrestrial plant growth and reproduction, regardless of their position of the bank and regardless of whether they are getting environmental flow or not. So with that, I'd like to conclude my presentation and acknowledging all the people who have supported me to conduct this experiment, especially my supervisors. Thank you so much.
Well done, Piyumi. That was awesome. Yeah, thank you so much. And yeah, filling in some of those gaps that Chris had mentioned in his presentation earlier, which is awesome. So questions, we've got a couple in the chat, but I might kick off with one that I have while we go through the chat ones as well. How is this information helpful for riparian restoration projects and to mitigate invasive plant species?
Yes, I would like to answer that question by talking about the grasses species, because we have seen in this experiment grasses species tend to have more sensitive for the summer inundation and spring inundation. So these invasive plants are exotic grasses or terrestrial grasses, then there will be having these flows during spring and summer can mitigate these growth of these species. And again, and we have seen that spring long inundation can affect the riparian plant growth as well. But we have seen in the summer inundation, the summer short inundation or summer long inundation seems to be beneficial for the riparian plants. So, and during summer, for some reason, grasses seems to be more sensitive than the riparian plants during summer. So even a short summer or a long summer inundation can reduce the growth of these plants. But if it is a riparian invasive plant, then there is a problem with that. But with the grasses, yes, we can mitigate those by using the environmental flows for some extent by looking at these results.
Yeah, awesome. So really, really helpful work in terms of helping guide management decision-making around environmental flows. Penelope, do you want to go through some of the questions in the chat?
Yeah, so there's just a couple about the experiments. One is, how established were the plants in the experiments, and were they planted in the same season as the inundation?
So this is regarding the nursery experiment. So they were purchased from a nursery, a commercial nursery, where they were at 12 to 16 month old. So then we keep it for another month to get established before we putting it to the treatment. So they are well established before we putting it to the treatment. But during the spring, they were like small, but during summer, they were a bit matured. So they have started flowering. So there's a bit of different in different season. So their life stage is different in different season when they get inundated.
Thank you. And the other one's quite similar. What were the temperatures in the tanks, and how do they compare to water temperatures in the field at the same season?
So yes, we have put the temperature loggers in every tank. So they were quite, there was no any changes in the old tanks, but I'm not sure how I think it's similar to the temperatures in the field as well. Yeah. So there's no any higher or very lower level temperature. So it's quite similar to the field water, I think. Yeah.
Cool. And I'm just jumping back to the question I asked about how established the plants were. There's just been a follow-up saying that was regarding the experiment on the Campaspe.
For the field experiment, we have put a matured plant. So they were like maybe I think it's 9 to 12 months old plants. So they were mature plants. We have used for the field experiment. Yeah.
Cool. Thank you. Maybe just one last one. Sewerage plants release water into creeks at times that suit them. They're proud that the water is clean, but make no mention of the volume impacts. How can this be changed?
So they will have a license to be able to release a certain volume at a certain time, and also at a certain quality. So there's a lot of conditions on those things. However, most of that those conditions are around the water quality. So having to meet quality standards. But it's spot on that in some cases the volume impacts are not carefully considered, and there can be negative impacts of a high flow volume at an inappropriate time that impacts different taxa. So that could be plants or any fauna as well. So either from a flow level point of view or a velocity point of view. So those things are really important, but it's really variable between systems where they are throughout the state, the ecology of the taxa in the waterways. There's a lot going on that needs to be carefully thought out to know if it's actually a problem or not.
Thanks, Chris. I did say that was the last one, so I might leave it there, but I'll let you get back to a few of the questions in the chat, and I'll also pop in your email addresses so people can reach out.
Yeah, very happy to be contacted. That sounds good.
Yeah, thank you. Thank you so much, both of you. Both excellent talks and covering a huge amount of work in this area that's been underway for a long time. So great to get that information out there and share just how important the work is for both policy and land management, and the contributions that our scientists make to helping inform those decisions. So I'll just get my notes up to make sure I'm not missing anything. So yeah, thank you so much to Chris and Piyumi for your talks, and thank you everyone for attending. Our next seminar is on changing human behaviour to save species and protect our environment, and it's on Monday the 29th of April from 1 till 2 p.m. That'll be featuring Dr. Lily Van Eden from RMIT University and ARI's case estimation. And if any of you are interested, Penny will put the link in the chat to the sign up. So you can sign up for our mailing list. We have not only the seminars, but we have a range of email updates that we send out across the year, so you can keep up to date with our latest science. Heaps of really interesting stories in there. And I'll just warn you as well that once this session ends, you won't have access to the chat. So if there's any links that you want to get or information you want to get out of the chat, scroll back up and copy those links now before we end the session, because the chat won't be available outside. But I will be. The session is recorded and it will go up on our ARI Seminars playlist in a couple of days. I'll send it out with the invite to the next session. So yeah, thank you everyone for attending. I think that's all from me. Thanks all. Have a lovely week.
Thanks.
Thank you.